The Pacific shimmered under the Malibu sun like a sheet of molten glass. White orchids lined the aisle, hundreds of them, trembling in the salty breeze. Every angle of the ceremony was flawless, curated by planners, filtered by photographers, approved by lawyers. It wasn't a wedding. It was a performance. Ava Johnson stood in a dress that fit like a second skin, silk the color of moonlight skin, the color of mahogany polished by God himself. Her smile was effortless, trained. She had practiced it the night before in the mirror of her tiny apartment, just to make sure it looked natural. Across from her stood Alexander Reed, a man who wore restraint like armor. He was tall, angular, his gray eyes unreadable, behind a calm so precise it felt artificial. The tabloids called him the Silver King billionaire founder of Reed Dynamics, the man who could turn steel into profit and silence into power. 3 years ago, he'd buried his wife after a tragic car accident. Since then, no one had seen him smile. Today he smiled, just enough for the cameras. Do you, Alexander Reed, take Ava Johnson to be your lawfully wedded wife? His answer came low, steady. I do. When it was Ava's turn, her voice barely wavered. I do. The applause that followed was thunderous, hollow, staged. Champagne flutes clinked, photographers shouted, drones hummed above like mechanical bees, capturing the illusion of happiness. Only Ava noticed how the groom's hand trembled slightly when he slipped the ring onto her finger. Not from love. From something else, memory maybe. Regret. The reception was held on the cliffside terrace of his private estate. Celebrities mingled with investors. The Pacific roared below, wild and ancient, like a secret none of them deserved to hear. Ava smiled until her cheeks ached. Every laugh, every tilt of her head, every polite nod was a line in a script she'd agreed to act. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes survival looks like surrender. Baby girl. When Alexander found her later, she was standing by the glass railing, barefoot, staring at the horizon, where the sky bled into the ocean. The sunset was too perfect to be real. Are you all right? His voice was deep, textured like velvet, worn thin. She turned to him. I didn't expect it to feel so quiet, she said. Weddings are supposed to be loud. He looked toward the crowd, people he knew, people who owed him, people who'd sell him out for a quote. Noise doesn't mean connection, he replied softly. Sometimes it just hides the emptiness. She studied him, searching for a crack in his composure. You sound like someone who's lived with emptiness for a long time. His gaze flicked to hers. For a fraction of a second, something raw passed through those pale eyes, then vanished. You learn to make peace with it, he said, then offered his arm. Come. They're waiting for us. As they walked back toward the crowd, Ava caught their reflections in the glass wall. A beautiful black woman beside a pale, handsome man. They looked powerful, expensive, untouchable, and utterly separate. Like two portraits hung in the same frame. Hours later, the party faded into whispers in car doors. The mansion grew quiet, echoing with the kind of silence that feels deliberate. Ava stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom that wasn't yet hers. Her reflection looked alien, soft curls, pinned into an elegant twist, diamond earrings, heavy against her skin, makeup flawless. A stranger wearing her face. The door opened behind her. Alexander stepped in, no tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He looked less like a groom and more like a man who hadn't slept in years. You don't have to be nervous, he said, his tone neutral. I'm not nervous, she lied. Just processing. He nodded, walking to the minibar. Champagne. No, thank you. He poured himself a glass anyway. The clink of crystal against steel echoed in the room. When he finally spoke again, his words landed like stones. This marriage, he began, is not meant to change your life too much. You'll have access to everything you need financially, socially, personally. My lawyers have drafted an agreement to protect both of us. Ava folded her arms, masking the sting. Protect us from what? Each other. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. From expectations. Right. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Wouldn't want those ruining the arrangement. He studied her quietly, then said, "You're sharper than most people give you credit for." "I've had to be." Silence stretched between them, dense and awkward. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Have you ever loved anyone?" "Truly." Ava blinked. "What?" He didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her eyes, gray and endless. "Love. Have you ever known it?" She gave a short laugh, bitter around the edges. "Love doesn't pay hospital bills, Alexander. It doesn't save businesses. It doesn't fix broken things." "Sometimes it does," he murmured. "Not in my world," she said, meeting his gaze. "In my world, love is a luxury, and I can't afford it." Something flickered across his face, understanding maybe, or pain. He set his glass down and walked closer, stopping just a few inches away. He reached out slowly, carefully, until his fingers brushed the back of her hand. It wasn't a possessive touch, nor a seductive one. It was hesitant, almost reverent. Ava froze. The warmth of his skin against hers was shockingly human, a reminder that behind the contracts and headlines, this man bled like anyone else. For a heartbeat, the air thickened. Then he pulled back. "Good night, Ava." She swallowed hard, nodding. "Good night, Alexander." When the door closed behind him, she exhaled only then, realizing she'd been holding her breath. In the days that followed, Ava learned the rhythms of his world. Mornings began with news briefings and the low hum of his voice through conference calls. Evenings ended in silence, 2 dinners shared across a table too long. They lived together, but not together, coexisting in a house made of glass and distance. And yet, there were moments, small, fragile things that cracked her defenses. The way he paused when she laughed. The faint scar on his wrist when he reached for a pen. The night she found him in his office at 2 a.m., asleep in his chair laptop, still glowing with a photo of a woman with golden hair and kind eyes. His late wife, Deborah. Ava had seen her face before on magazine covers in the framed photo that still sat on his desk. But seeing it there, illuminated in the dark, something inside her twisted. Not from jealousy, but from understanding. She whispered into the quiet, "You still talk to her, don't you?" Alexander stirred, but didn't wake. His lips moved slightly, forming words meant for someone long gone. Ava stepped back, the ache in her chest. Unfamiliar, unwelcome. For the first time, she wondered if she'd stepped into a life still haunted by ghosts. The next morning, he was at the table, freshly shaved, crisp suit, coffee in hand. The picture of control. Ava almost believed she'd imagined the night before, until he looked up and said softly, "You didn't sleep much." She met his eyes, calm. "Neither did you." A pause. Then he said, "You don't have to pretend here, Ava. Not with me." That almost made her laugh. Pretending is part of the deal. Remember? His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said something that made her chest tighten. "Maybe I was wrong about what we're protecting ourselves from." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood, leaving his coffee half finished. The faint scent of cedar and salt lingered in his wake. She watched him go, realizing that behind his carefully measured words, there was something neither of them had planned for, something that scared them both. That night, when Ava lay alone in the vast bed overlooking the Pacific, she heard the ocean roar beneath the cliffs. The same ocean that had witnessed her vows, her lies, her hesitation. She turned toward the window. In the distance, she saw him on the terrace, silhouetted against the moonlight, glass of whiskey in hand, face turned toward the sea. He looked like a man who'd built an empire just to keep from drowning, and she foolishly wanted to reach him. When he finally came inside, he paused at her door. Their eyes met in the dim light. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "Tomorrow we move into the city. There's a house waiting. You'll have your own space." She nodded, though the words stung. Your own space. So this was how it would be, two strangers bound by gold rings and unspoken rules. But as he turned to go, he hesitated. His voice dropped almost a whisper. "Good night, Ava." She replied softer than she meant to "Good night, Alexander." When the door closed, she stared at it for a long time, wondering why her chest hurt. Outside, the waves crashed harder, as if warning her the calm never lasts. The new house wasn't really a house. It was a cathedral of glass and silence perched high above San Francisco Bay. The walls were transparent, the air immaculate, the view infinite. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like being watched. Ava stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by architecture worth more than her family's entire company. The late afternoon light bled gold across the marble floor, slicing her reflection into fragments. For a moment, she thought this place has no shadows, because everything here already is one. Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. "Do you like it?" She turned. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, his posture as perfect as ever. The city behind him shimmered glass upon glass, mirroring his world, transparent but untouchable. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Then after a beat, "And cold." His lips twitched just slightly. Cold can be controlled. Heat can't. She almost smiled. "You'd know." He looked at her, then really looked, and for a second she saw something human flicker in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps. But before she could name it, he turned away. They fell into a rhythm not of closeness, but of coexistence. In the mornings, Alexander left before sunrise, his footsteps soundless against the marble. His car would vanish down the winding road, and the house would fall into a silence that pressed against her skin. Ava filled it with small rebellions, rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging, leaving sketchbooks open on the counter, buying wildflowers that clashed with the minimalist decor. Every vase of color she placed felt like a declaration, "I exist here too." She took long walks along the cliffs, wind tearing through her curls, the sea hurling its endless roar against the rocks. It reminded her she was still alive, that she wasn't dissolving into the glass. At night, Alexander would return, impeccable suit, quiet exhaustion behind his eyes. They ate together sometimes, speaking in polite fragments. "How was your day?" "Productive." "Yours?" "Still learning the house." Then silence. It wasn't hostility that filled the space between them. It was distance, carefully cultivated, fragile, deliberate. Like a truce, neither of them had the courage to break. One night, unable to sleep, Ava wandered into his study. The room was dimly lit walls, lined with books and glass panels overlooking the bay. On his desk, a single photograph faced the window, a woman with golden hair and kind eyes. Deborah. Ava traced the air above the frame, not touching, only feeling the weight of it. The woman seemed alive, even in stillness. Graceful. Untouchable. Everything Ava wasn't. "You shouldn't be here." The voice behind her was quiet but carried steel. Ava froze, then turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie gone. The moonlight softened him, but his expression was guarded. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her tone neutral. "I was exploring my dead wife's face." His words weren't cruel, but they cut anyway. Ava's throat tightened. "No. I was trying to understand the man I married." For a long moment, he didn't respond. The air between them pulsed with something raw and heavy. Then quietly he said, "There are things you don't need to understand." Maybe she whispered, "But you asked me once if I'd ever loved anyone. Maybe I'd like to know who you loved so I can understand what I'm supposed to compete with." His eyes darkened, a storm gathering behind gray glass. "You can't compete with a ghost, Ava." "I'm not trying to," she said. "But you keep her alive like you're afraid to let her die." He stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "Be careful," he said softly, dangerously. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," she said, lifting her chin. "But maybe you don't either." The silence that followed was sharp enough to break. Then, to her surprise, he didn't shout, didn't storm out. Instead, his voice dropped to something broken. "She was everything I wasn't ready to lose." The honesty in that sentence undid her. It wasn't arrogance or control. It was grief stripped bare. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire or a widower, but as a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what air felt like. Ava stepped closer, her voice low. "You don't have to punish yourself forever." He looked at her eyes, searching hers, as if weighing whether to believe her. Then he said something she didn't expect. "And what if punishment is the only thing that keeps me human?" That night, she lay awake long after he left the room. His words echoed in her chest. She thought of the way his voice had cracked, of the loneliness that wrapped him like armor. And she wondered if she'd made a mistake coming here, not because she didn't belong, but because she was starting to care. Days passed. The house remained glass, and so did they. But cracks began to appear, not visible, but felt. She caught him watching her, sometimes his gaze softer than before. Once in the kitchen, their hands brushed when they reached for the same mug. Neither pulled away. It was only a second, but it lingered longer than it should have. Another morning, she found a new vase of lilies on the counter. No note, no explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement. She smiled despite herself. But every time she thought they were drawing closer, something in him pulled back. A phone call in the middle of dinner, a locked door at midnight, a look in his eyes that said, "Don't ask." Ava told herself she didn't care. She told herself she was here for stability, not love. But lies sound hollow when whispered too often. The breaking point came one rainy evening. She had been sketching near the window, tracing the outline of the bay, when she heard voices from the hall. Alexander's and someone else's, low and tense. "Yes, I know what I promised." Alexander's voice snapped. "This merger depends on discretion. She's not part of that world." "She's your wife," the other man replied. "Sooner or later she will be." A pause. Then his voice again, colder. "Ava is necessary. That's all." The words landed like a slap. Necessary. Not wanted. Not chosen. Ava stayed frozen until the footsteps faded. Then she stood, heart hammering, the sketchpad falling from her lap. Necessary. The word kept echoing, poisoning everything. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't have to. The silence between them did the talking. The next morning, she was gone before dawn, down to the cliffs, the wind tearing through her coat. The ocean was merciless, beautiful, alive. She envied it. It moved freely without apology. She stayed there for hours until she heard his voice behind her. "Ava." She didn't turn. "Do you know what's funny?" she said. "I thought marrying you would make me invisible to the world. Turns out it just made me invisible to you." He stepped closer, rain dampening his hair, his breath visible in the cold air. "You weren't supposed to hear that conversation." "That's the problem," she said, finally facing him. "You keep treating me like a secret to manage, not a person to know." His jaw tightened. "You knew what this was." "I thought I did." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. but you keep changing the rules." He hesitated, then said quietly, "I'm trying to protect you." From what she demanded. "From you." He looked away, the muscles in his throat working. "From the parts of me that destroy everything they touch." The honesty in his voice cracked her open, but she didn't let it show. "Then maybe stop pretending you're unbreakable," she said. "Because you're not. You're just alone." The rain intensified, sheets of water falling between them like glass melting. For a moment, he looked as if he might say something that would change everything. But he didn't. He only whispered, "You should go inside," and turned away. That night, Ava stood by the window, staring at her reflection in the rain-slicked glass. She saw herself barefoot, tired, heart raw, and behind her, the faint silhouette of a man who couldn't love without breaking. The thunder rolled low and distant. Somewhere in the house, Alexander's office door closed, and Ava for the first time realized the true nature of this place. The walls weren't built to keep the world out. They were built to keep him in. She touched the cold glass, her breath fogging its perfect surface, and whispered to no one, "Something has to change." Outside, lightning split the sky. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second morning, the city below was wrapped in fog bridges, vanishing into clouds like unfinished thoughts. Inside the glass house, time seemed to slow, each drop of rain tracing its own lonely path down the windows, the air thick with things neither of them could say. Ava hadn't spoken to Alexander since that night on the cliffs. He'd tried once, gently knocked on her studio door, said her name softly, but she had pretended not to hear. The truth was, she didn't know which hurt more, his words or her own silence. She worked instead. Sketches covered every inch of the floor lines, colors, forms, furniture that breathed warmth instead of perfection. She didn't know if she was designing or trying to build a world that felt like home. But even as her pencil moved, she kept seeing him, the way the rain had clung to his hair, the way his voice had cracked when he said, "I'm trying to protect you." From what she still didn't know, that evening she found him in the kitchen. He looked tired, sleeves rolled up, a loosened tie around his neck. He was cutting lemons, his hands steady, mechanical. Ava paused in the doorway. "You cook now?" He didn't look up. "I slice fruit. Cooking implies joy." She wanted to smile but couldn't. "Do you ever let yourself enjoy anything?" "I used to," he said simply, and placed the knife down. Silence stretched. Rain tapped against the glass walls, patient and persistent. Finally, she said, "I'm not your project, Alexander." He turned, leaning against the counter. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was softer than she expected. "I know. Then stop trying to fix me or hide me, or whatever it is you think you're doing." "I'm not trying to fix you," he said, his tone low. "I'm trying not to break you." Something inside her twisted. "You're not that powerful." He took a step closer. "You don't understand what happens when people get close to me." "Then explain it," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Stop talking in riddles and start telling the truth." For a moment, he looked like he might. Then he exhaled, eyes closing. "You think you want the truth," he murmured. "But once you have it, you won't look at me the same way. Try me." He opened his eyes, gray and haunted. "Deborah didn't die in an accident, Ava." "Not exactly." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening. She took her own life. Because of something I did." The words hit like thunder. Ava's hand went to her chest. Oh my God. She was struggling for months. Depression, anxiety, the pressure of being my wife. I kept pretending everything was fine, told her to rest, told her she was strong. When she asked me to stop a merger, to step back, I said no. The night before she died, we argued. I left. She didn't. He looked at her, then eyes, raw, voice breaking. "So yes, I built this world of glass to keep everything perfect, because the last time I let something real in it, shattered. Ava's breath came unevenly. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too small. Finally, she whispered, "You can't carry her death forever." He laughed softly, bitterly. "I don't know how to put it down." They stood in silence, the storm raging around them. The confession hung heavy, filling the space between their breaths. Then, without thinking, Ava reached for his hand. He flinched, instinctive, but didn't pull away. His skin was cold. Hers was warm. The contrast felt like truth itself, two people built from opposite elements meeting in the middle. "You can't undo the past," she said quietly, "but you can stop letting it punish you." He looked at her, searching her face for judgment. There was none. Only compassion, fierce and trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You should hate me." She shook her head. "I should, but I don't." Something in him broke then, so subtly she almost missed it. His shoulders dropped, his breath hitched. For the first time, Alexander Reed looked less like a billionaire and more like a man simply trying to survive himself. Later they sat on the floor, two glasses of untouched whiskey between them. The power flickered once, then went out completely. The room fell into a velvet kind of darkness, lit only by the silver glow of the storm through the glass. "Do you ever wonder," Ava asked softly, "if love is supposed to hurt this much?" He turned toward her eyes, reflecting lightning. "It shouldn't. But maybe it always does. Then why do we keep chasing it?" He hesitated. "Because without it, nothing means anything." Ava smiled faintly. "That's the first honest thing you've said all week." He chuckled, quiet but genuine. It startled her, the sound. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed laughter. And for the first time, she saw how beautiful he was when he wasn't holding himself together. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere deep in the house, thunder rolled like a sigh. Ava leaned back against the glass wall, closing her eyes. When she opened them, Alexander was still watching her. What she asked. He shook his head. "You remind me of light." That sounds like something a man says before he breaks a heart. He smiled, a ghost of one. "No. You remind me of light because you don't know how much you change a room just by standing in it." Ava's pulse stumbled. That's dangerous talk for a man who swore not to feel anything. "Maybe I'm tired of not feeling," he said. "Maybe I'm tired of pretending this isn't happening." She looked at him for a long moment, the air between them charged with something fragile and wild. Then she whispered, "Then stop pretending." He didn't move for a full heartbeat, then another, and then he did. When his hand reached her cheek, it wasn't the touch of a man claiming something. It was the touch of someone finding his way home through the dark. Their lips met slowly, hesitant at first, then deeper, like two broken melodies finally forming one song. The storm outside built again, a low rhythm against the glass. She could taste salt and whiskey and sorrow and want, everything they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, she was trembling. "This doesn't fix anything," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but maybe it starts something." They didn't sleep. They talked instead about her childhood in Atlanta, about his first job in a garage, about the ways ambition could both save and destroy. Each story was a thread, and by dawn, they'd woven something that looked dangerously close to intimacy. But morning light is cruel to fragile things. When the storm cleared, reality returned with the calm. Ava woke alone. His side of the couch was cold. On the table lay an envelope with her name written in his careful, deliberate script. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Ava, last night, for the first time in years, I felt something I thought I'd buried. That terrifies me. You terrify me not because of what you might do, but because of what I might become. I need time. I need to think. I don't want to hurt you the way I hurt her." A. She read it twice, then again. Her throat burned. Her eyes stung, but no tears came. Only that quiet, empty ache that settles after a truth too heavy to carry. By evening, the glass house was silent again. Alexander was gone. Ava walked through each room, the study, the kitchen, the terrace, touching the spaces he had filled with his absence. Outside the bay glowed beneath the fading sun, calm now, pretending it hadn't just raged. She stood before the wall of glass, watching her own reflection blur into the view. She looked smaller somehow, but stronger too. Maybe love wasn't about saving someone, she thought. Maybe it was about standing beside their ruin long enough for them to see what they still had left. Somewhere inside the empty house, the heater clicked on, breaking the silence. And Ava, with tears she didn't wipe away, whispered into the air, "Then I'll wait." But not forever. The rain had stopped. The world outside gleamed clean and new. Inside, the glass still stood, but this time she could see the cracks. The house stayed empty for a week. Ava stopped counting after the fifth sunrise when the scent of his cologne finally faded from the hallway. The silence grew roots, filling the corners of every room. Each morning she told herself she'd leave, that she'd pack the little she owned and walk away from this glass cathedral of ghosts. Each night she stayed, because leaving would mean it hadn't meant anything, and she couldn't bear that thought. She worked instead. Her sketches grew darker, wilder, sharp lines, raw shapes, bold strokes of color that bled outside the page. Her designs no longer whispered perfection. They screamed feeling. Sometimes, when she looked at what she'd drawn, she barely recognized the woman behind the pencil. On the 8th day, Alexander came back. The sound of the front door startled her, sharp and sudden, breaking the spell of solitude. She turned from her drafting table, just as he appeared at the threshold. He looked different, not unkempt. Alexander Reed would never allow that, but less polished. There was stubble along his jaw, a crease in his shirt, exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said quietly. Ava crossed her arms. "I didn't think you'd come back. I shouldn't have left." She studied him, wary. "But you did." He nodded, guilt flickering across his face. "Because I thought distance would make sense of what I was feeling. It didn't. Did you find clarity?" His gaze met hers. "No. I found regret." The words hung between them like rain before it falls. Ava exhaled slowly. "You can't keep running from the past, Alexander. Sooner or later it finds you." He gave a humorless smile. "It already has." That evening, the past arrived quite literally. They were in the living room when his phone began to buzz. Over and over. He ignored it at first until Ava noticed the color drain from his face. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. He handed her the phone instead. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Deborah Reed, back from the dead. A new expose questions the death of philanthropist Deborah Reed. Evidence suggests her car crash may have been staged. Sources claim she's been living abroad under a different name. Ava blinked, her breath catching. "This isn't real." "It's tabloids," he said quickly, but his voice was unsteady. "Then why do you look like you believe it?" He didn't reply. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink. Deborah's body was never... He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. This is garbage." But the next morning, it wasn't garbage anymore. It was everywhere. News anchors dissected his life on morning television. Journalists camped outside the gates. Old photos resurfaced him and Deborah at galas, her radiant beside him. And Ava in every headline was a footnote. The replacement, the dark-skinned wife, the woman who married for money. By noon, her phone had hundreds of missed calls from friends, reporters, strangers with opinions. She turned it off. Alexander stayed in his office, taking calls with lawyers and PR teams. His voice calm but distant. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't look at her. The house had never felt more transparent or more suffocating. By the third day, Ava couldn't stand it. She stormed into his study, slamming the door behind her. "Are you going to talk to me?" she demanded. "Or should I just keep finding out about your life from the news?" He looked up, startled. "Ava, this isn't what my problem. Because every article out there has my name on it." His expression hardened. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? I think you're shutting me out." Again. He stood abruptly, the control cracking in his voice. "Because this isn't about us. This is about something that should have stayed buried." Ava flinched, but refused to back down. "You don't get to decide that anymore." He went quiet, breathing unevenly. "If she's alive, if this is real, then I'm the reason she disappeared. That's not true." He looked at her with an emptiness that made her chest ache. "You don't understand what I did to her." "Then help me understand," she said softly. "Let me in." His lips parted, but before he could answer, his phone rang again. The sound sliced through the tension like a blade. He glanced at the screen, froze, then whispered, "It's her." Ava's stomach dropped. "What?" He hesitated, then hit accept. A woman's voice came through the speaker, low and shaking. "Hello, Alexander." He went pale. "Deborah." Ava stood motionless, her pulse roaring in her ears. "It's me," the voice said. "I shouldn't have called. But they're digging now. I couldn't stay hidden anymore." He closed his eyes. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe. I just needed you to know. I'm sorry." The line went dead. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ava whispered, "It's real." Alexander nodded faintly, setting the phone down like it burned. "She's alive." Ava felt dizzy. "Then all this time she wanted to disappear," he said, almost to himself. "She didn't die because of me. She ran from me." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His composure cracked, shoulders trembling. "I spent years drowning in guilt for something that never happened." Ava approached him slowly, her voice gentle. "Then you can stop blaming yourself." He looked up at her, anguish and confusion twisting together. "Can I? Because now, I have to ask what's worse, being the reason she died, or the reason she wanted to vanish." The pain in his words made her want to touch him, to pull him out of his own despair. But before she could, he stepped back. "I need to see her." Ava's heart sank. "Alexander, I need to look her in the eye," he said. "I need to know why." She swallowed hard. And what happens after that, I don't know. For the first time, Ava couldn't read him. The man before her wasn't the one she had fought with, or kissed, or forgiven. He was someone lost between past and present, a man haunted not by ghosts, but by the living. That night, Ava stood on the balcony watching city lights blur into a river of gold. Somewhere below, people were laughing, moving, existing freely. She envied them. Alexander came out quietly. The air between them felt brittle. "I leave tomorrow," he said. She nodded, keeping her voice steady. "I figured. I don't expect you to wait." A bitter laugh escaped her. "You always say that, as if waiting for you is something I plan." He hesitated. "Ava." "No," she said softly, turning to face him. "Don't say my name like that. Not if you're walking away again." His expression tightened with regret. "I'm not walking away. I'm closing a chapter that never really ended." "Then make sure it ends," she whispered. "Because if you come back still half living in her shadow, I won't be here next time." For a heartbeat, they just stood there, two silhouettes against the city. Then unexpectedly he stepped forward and cupped her face in his hands. The touch was desperate, reverent. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "To love someone without breaking them." Ava looked at him, tears threatening. "Then learn." He kissed her once, brief, aching like a promise that might never be kept. When he pulled away, she whispered, "Go find her truth. Then find your own." At dawn, the car waited in the driveway. Ava watched from the window as Alexander stepped inside, the engine's hum fading down the hill until there was nothing left but wind. For the first time since she'd met him, she didn't feel like the one being left behind. She felt like the one standing still while the world began to move again. The glass house glowed with morning light, fragile and empty. Ava looked around at its perfect transparency and smiled sadly. Every wall reflected her now, not as a silhouette in someone else's story, but as a woman learning to choose herself. Still, when the sun rose higher, she whispered into the quiet, "Come back whole, Alexander. Or don't come back at all." The news broke before dawn. Ava woke to the hum of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. Half asleep, she reached for it, expecting another meaningless alert. Instead, the screen glared with a single headline in bold white letters. Alexander Reed reunites with missing wife. Deborah Reed, official statement expected. Her chest constricted. For a long moment, she just stared at it, willing the words to disappear. They didn't. Below the headline was a grainy photo, Alexander outside a hotel in Zurich, hand brushing the arm of a woman whose blonde hair was unmistakable, even in the blur of flashbulbs. Deborah. The article beneath it was cruel in its simplicity. Sources close to the family confirm that Mrs. Reed has resurfaced. The couple will address the press together in the coming days. Ava dropped the phone onto the bed. The sound was too small for the weight of what it carried. By noon, the media had reached the gates. Helicopters hovered. Cameras flashed. She stayed inside, curtains drawn, watching the world twist her life into gossip. The phone rang again. Not Alexander, not even his assistant. A stranger. Mrs. Reed. The voice was polite, rehearsed. "This is Martin Wells from the Times. We'd like to offer you a chance to respond to Mr. Reed's statement." She hung up. The silence afterward was deafening. When she finally called him, the line went straight to voicemail. The message she left was short, trembling. "Just tell me if it's true." He didn't call back. 2 days later, he appeared on television. She didn't mean to watch, but when his face filled the screen, she couldn't look away. He stood beside Deborah at a press conference in Geneva, cameras flashing like lightning. He looked exhausted, older. Deborah looked alive, but brittle. Her smile practiced, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When he began to speak, Ava's stomach twisted. 3 years ago, he said, voice steady, "My wife Deborah suffered from severe depression, following personal struggles that were never made public. She chose to leave to find peace and privacy. Her return today is something I never thought possible. I'm grateful she's alive. I ask that the press give us both space to navigate what this means." No mention of Ava. Not a word. Not wife. Not love. Not truth. Ava turned off the TV and stared at the black screen. Her reflection looked back at her, still hollow, utterly silent. For the first time since coming to that glass house she packed. The motion felt mechanical. Clothes, sketchbooks, the tiny silver bracelet her mother had given her when she left Atlanta. As she closed her suitcase, a gust of wind rattled the glass walls. The sound reminded her of the storm the night they'd broken and rebuilt each other. Now, it just sounded like goodbye. But before she could leave, the doorbell rang. Alexander stood on the threshold, unshaven, rain-soaked, the kind of exhausted that doesn't come from travel, but from guilt. He looked at her as if unsure she'd open the door at all. "You came back?" she said, her voice calm in a way that frightened them both. "I had to." Why to explain? Or to ask forgiveness for something you can't even name? He stepped inside, dripping water onto the floor. It wasn't what it looked like. Then what was it, she demanded? because from where I'm standing, it looked like you standing beside your wife thanking the world for her return. She's not my wife anymore. She was on your arm. She needed protection." Ava laughed sharp and small. "From what, Alexander? The truth." He winced. "She's sick, Ava. She's been hiding for years, living with people who kept her medicated and scared. When she reached out, she didn't want fame or forgiveness. She wanted safety. I went because I owed her that much." "And the press conference?" "That was her condition," he said quietly. "She needed to be seen as whole again. I thought if I agreed, she'd disappear from the headlines. I didn't know they'd turn it into a circus. You could have told me." "I couldn't. It wasn't safe." "For her?" Ava asked. "Or for you?" His silence was an answer. They stood there, thunder rolling faintly over the bay. "I spent years believing I'd killed her," he said finally. "Then I found out she was alive and broken, and I realized maybe I'd done both." Ava's eyes softened despite herself. "You can't keep saving everyone, Alexander." "I wasn't trying to save her," he said. "I was trying not to lose you." "Then why did you?" He met her gaze, anguish flickering behind restraint. "Because I don't know how to hold two truths at once." She swallowed. "That you loved her, and that you might love me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I do." Ava shook her head. "Then prove it. Not with apologies, with courage." Days turned into a blur of noise. The story wouldn't die. Reporters began circling Ava directly outside her studio, her favorite coffee shop, even her mother's house. Every headline turned her into something she wasn't. The other woman, the gold digger widow, the substitute bride. When she finally spoke publicly, it wasn't through a press conference. It was through her work. Ava accepted an interview with Architectural Digest, the first she'd ever agreed to. They expected her to talk about design trends. Instead, she talked about survival, beauty. She said sitting in front of a wall of sketches isn't symmetry, it's fracture. It's what happens when something breaks, and you still decide to make it matter. The article went viral overnight. Not as scandal, but as art. For the first time, Ava's name stood on its own without his. Meanwhile, in Geneva, the truth began to splinter. A former caretaker leaked documents proving Deborah had voluntarily disappeared, aided by a private physician, and funded through a hidden account under her name. Alexander's lawyers confirmed he hadn't been aware. Public sympathy shifted. The narrative changed. But the damage between him and Ava remained a quiet battlefield no one else could see. One night, weeks later, she found him waiting at her new studio in downtown San Francisco. He was standing by the window watching the lights flicker across the bay. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "I didn't come to fix anything," he replied. "I came to tell you the truth." She folded her arms. "Go on." Deborah left again. This time for good. She's somewhere getting treatment. She signed the divorce papers. Ava didn't answer. "She asked me to stop trying to make things right," he continued. "She said forgiveness isn't an equation. It's a decision." Ava studied him. "And have you made yours?" He nodded. "I forgave myself. And her. And I came here to ask if you could do the same." "For what?" "For everything," he said simply. "For leaving. For lying. For not knowing how to love you the way you deserved." Ava walked closer, her voice trembling. "You can't ask me to erase what happened." "I'm not asking you to erase it," he said. "I'm asking you to see what's left." She stared at him, at the man who had built empires out of precision, and now stood before her completely undone. And for the first time, she didn't see the billionaire, or the widower, or the man haunted by the past. She saw the one thing he'd never shown the world: vulnerability. Ava reached out, touching his face. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I'll wait," he whispered. But not silently this time. Outside, the city glowed beneath them, alive with noise and light. Inside, Two people stood in the quiet, their hearts learning a new language, one built not from promises, but from truth. For the first time, Ava didn't feel like someone inside his story. She felt like someone standing beside it. And maybe, just maybe, that was what love really was. Not rescue, not redemption, but recognition. The first time they saw each other again outside of apologies, it was by accident. Ava was presenting her new interior collection at a design expo in Los Angeles, her first major showcase under her own name. The gallery was minimalist, washed in soft gold light, her work arranged like a living conversation between steel and warmth. Every piece felt personal curved lines, where there had once been sharp corners, textures that invited touch instead of distance. It was the opposite of Alexander's world, and yet he was there. She didn't see him at first, but the crowd shifted, a ripple of awareness, and then he was standing by the far wall, hands in his pockets, gaze steady on her. For a moment, she froze, breath caught somewhere between surprise and ache. He looked different, quieter, leaner, the arrogance stripped away, like someone who'd walked through fire and hadn't decided yet whether he'd survived. Their eyes met. The noise around them faded. Later, when the event ended and the lights dimmed, she found him waiting near the exit. The world outside hummed with the thrum of night traffic. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure I should," he admitted. "But then I realized I've spent half my life doing what makes sense instead of what matters." She studied him, trying to find the right distance. "So, which am I?" He smiled faintly. "You're the only thing that ever felt like both." Ava exhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle between them. "How's Geneva over?" he said. "I sold the European branch." Stepped down from the board. She blinked. "You stepped down?" "I wanted to see what happens when I stop building empires and start building something that doesn't need defending." There was something raw in his tone. Not regret, not pride, just truth. Ava crossed her arms. "And you think that starts here with me?" "No," he said softly. "I think it starts with honesty, and you're the only person who ever demanded it." They walked together through the parking lot, the night air sharp and clean. For a while, neither spoke. The rhythm of their footsteps filled the silence. Then, without turning, Ava asked, "Do you still blame yourself for her?" He hesitated. "Every day, but differently now." "What does that mean?" "It means the guilt doesn't own me anymore," he said. "It sits beside me quietly, like a shadow I've stopped trying to erase." She nodded. "Shadows don't disappear. You just learn to walk with them." He glanced at her, a small, genuine smile tugging at his mouth. "You sound like you've been talking to mine." "Maybe I have," she said, and for the first time in months, they laughed softly, carefully, as if testing the air. They ended up at a small diner off Sunset Boulevard, the kind with flickering neon lights and cheap coffee that tasted like memory. It was almost empty, the waitress half asleep behind the counter. Ava stirred her cup absently. "You know, you once told me control was the only way to survive." He tilted his head. "And you told me love doesn't pay bills." She smiled. "I was right." He smirked. "You were both right and wrong. Explain." He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Control keeps you alive. Love makes being alive worth it." Ava studied him, the way his hands wrapped around the mug, the faint scar on his wrist, the quiet gravity that had replaced his old precision. "When did you start talking like a poet?" "When I realized logic can't heal what it doesn't understand." Her laughter filled the empty diner, low and warm. "You're impossible." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, tentative, almost shy. "And you're patient." She didn't pull away. The contact was small, but it felt like everything. After all they'd broken, the simplest touch became a kind of resurrection. They began to meet again slowly, deliberately, like two people relearning a language they'd once spoken fluently and then forgotten. Coffee on Tuesdays, walks on weekends. No promises, no labels, just presence. Sometimes they talked about her projects, sometimes about nothing at all. He listened differently now, not to respond, but to understand. And she began to trust silence again, no longer afraid of what might echo inside it. One afternoon he showed up at her studio unannounced, holding a folded newspaper. She raised an eyebrow. "If that's another headline, I don't want it." "It's not," he said, handing it to her. The front page read, "Reed Dynamics appoints Ava Johnson as lead designer for new sustainability initiative." She stared. "This is your company," was he corrected. "Now it's something better. I want to rebuild, but not as I was, as who I might be. And I want your vision to lead it." Ava looked at him, unsure whether to laugh or curse. "So this is your way of saying sorry?" "No," he said softly. "It's my way of saying I believe in what you build, even when I can't build it myself." The sincerity disarmed her. For the first time she believed he wasn't offering a handout, but a hand open. Still, she hesitated. "If I say yes, this can't be about us." He nodded. "It isn't. It's about purpose. Whatever we are, it'll find its own way." She smiled faintly. "You've changed." "Maybe I just started listening," he said. "To you, to myself, to the silence I used to be afraid of." Months passed. The project grew, a collaboration that surprised everyone and healed what neither had expected. They argued sometimes about design budgets, schedules, his tendency to overanalyze, her need for independence. But the arguments ended differently now, not in slammed doors, but in pauses, not in silence, but in laughter. One night after a long meeting, they stayed in the empty office overlooking the bay. The city lights shimmered below like spilled stars. Ava leaned against the window. "You ever think about how strange this is? What us? This." She gestured around. "How something that started as a transaction became whatever this is." He stepped beside her, close, but not too close. "Maybe the best things start that way, as accidents." She looked up at him, the light catching the lines of his face. "You really think we could make it work this time?" He hesitated. "If we stop trying to make it perfect." A small, quiet moment passed, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a turning point, but feels like one anyway. Ava turned toward him, eyes soft. "Then let's stop." And she kissed him, not like the first time when everything burned, but like the second breath after drowning. Slow, grounding, alive. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "You terrify me," he murmured. She smiled against his lips. "Good. That means you're alive." Later that night, he drove her home through the fog. The city blurred into watercolor around them, orange, gold, fading blue. She rested her head against the window, half asleep, listening to the sound of tires on wet asphalt. At a red light, he glanced at her, her profile soft, peaceful. And in that instant, he knew the noise, the empire, the endless chase for control. None of it had ever been living. This was. When they reached her apartment, she turned to him. "You're not coming in." He shook his head. "Not tonight." "Why?" "Because I want to learn what it feels like to wait for the right moment." She smiled, quiet and full. "Then good night." "Alexander." "Good night, Ava." He watched her walk away until she disappeared behind the door. Inside the car, the silence felt different, not empty, but full of breath. The kind that fills space when two people finally stop running from themselves. He leaned back, exhaling, and whispered into the night, "This time, I won't lose her." And for once, the world didn't feel like glass. It had been a year since the firestorm of cameras, courtrooms, and ghosts. Now the noise was gone. Ava and Alexander had moved quietly to a house overlooking the Sierra Nevada, far from the glass towers and restless cities that had once defined them. It wasn't grand, just wide windows, soft wood, and air that smelled of pine and distance. They built a life that didn't need to impress anyone. A rhythm made of small things, coffee before sunrise, paint under her nails, soil under his fingers, the steady thrum of quiet that neither had known how to live inside before. And sometimes, when the morning light crept through the curtains, Ava would wake to find him tracing lazy circles on her bare shoulder. Not possessive, not fearful, just present. It was the kind of peace people spent whole lives running toward, only to realize they'd been standing on it all along. But peace has a way of testing those who think they've earned it. It began with a cough, faint, persistent, the kind people ignore because admitting it might make it real. Ava brushed it off at first. Long nights, too much work, a stubborn cold. Until one morning, she coughed blood onto her paint cloth. She stared at it for a long time, the deep red soaking through the white linen. Then quietly she folded it away. Weeks passed. She hid it well, the fatigue, the dizziness, the way her hands trembled when she tried to hold a pencil. She told herself she'd see a doctor soon, once the exhibition in New York was over, once the timing felt right. But secrets she'd learned never stay silent for long. One evening, as she worked in her studio, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, quick, bright, and cruel. The next thing she knew, the world tilted, and she was on the floor, breath scraping her throat like glass. She heard footsteps. Alexander's voice, distant at first, then close, panicked. "Ava, Ava, stay with me." Then darkness. When she opened her eyes, the world smelled like antiseptic and rain. Hospital walls, machines humming softly beside her, and Alexander asleep in the chair, his hand still gripping hers. His face was pale, his tie undone, eyes bruised from sleeplessness. He'd always been beautiful, in control. Now undone, he was devastating. She whispered, voice thin as air, "You stayed." He stirred instantly, gripping her hand tighter. "You scared the hell out of me." "What happened?" "You collapsed. The doctor said." He stopped, breath catching. "You have pneumonia. They're running tests to make sure it hasn't spread." Ava nodded slowly, too tired to be afraid. "So, I'm not dying." His jaw tightened. "No one's dying," he said fiercely, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. She gave a faint smile. "That sounds like something you'd tell yourself more than me." He exhaled shakily. "Don't joke. Not about this." The days that followed blurred tests, results, recovery. The diagnosis wasn't fatal, but it was sobering: chronic lung inflammation from years of overwork and exposure to paint chemicals. Treatable, but not curable. For Alexander, it became a war against helplessness. He arranged specialists, nutritionists, built an air filtering system in the house, turned every corner of their quiet retreat into a sanctuary. He fought the illness like it was a hostile takeover, methodical, relentless. But Ava, she didn't want to fight. Not like that. She wanted to live. One afternoon, when the doctor had just left, she found him in the kitchen, pacing, phone in hand. "I can fly in a pulmonary specialist from Zurich," he was saying. "There's a treatment, Alexander." Her voice was soft but firm enough to stop him. He turned, startled. "What is it?" "Stop." He blinked. "Stop what?" "Trying to fix me." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. "I'm not fixing," he said quietly. "I'm protecting." She shook her head. "You're controlling again." He winced. Because I can't lose you. Ava stepped closer, touching his chest. You won't. But you have to stop treating my life like it's a problem to be solved. His hands trembled as he reached for her. I don't know how to do anything else. Yes, you do, she whispered. You just have to learn how to be with me, not rescue me. The words broke something open in him, the same way they had years ago in Malibu. Only this time he didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes wet, voice breaking. Then teach me. That night, she took him outside to the porch. The air was cool, the mountains soaked in the last light of day. She placed a blanket over their shoulders, leaning into him. Do you remember the night we met? She asked. He smiled faintly. The contract wedding, the champagne, the lie. Yes, she said, chuckling softly. You asked me if I'd ever loved anyone. I remember. I didn't answer honestly. He turned surprised. No. She shook her head. Back then, I didn't know what love really was. I thought it was fire, fast, beautiful, destructive. But it's not. What is it then? It's this, she whispered. Sitting next to someone who saw the worst parts of you and still chose to stay. He swallowed hard. I didn't choose it, Ava. I couldn't have done anything else. Her smile was gentle, tired. That's still a choice. They sat in silence, the sun sinking behind the hills. For a moment, there was no sickness, no past, only the warmth of his hand, the quiet rhythm of two hearts that had fought their way back to the same place. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the pines soft and pale, like breath frozen mid-air. Ava grew stronger, slowly, stubbornly. But with recovery came something unexpected: restlessness. She'd built her career on beauty, but now she wanted meaning. She began sketching again, not for clients or galleries, but for herself. A new collection called Reclaimed Air. It was raw, honest furniture shaped like lungs designs that seemed to inhale and exhale with light. When she showed Alexander, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, You're turning pain into art again. She smiled. It's what keeps me alive. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You keep me alive. On the first warm day of spring, they drove to the top of the hill behind their home. The grass was golden, the sky clear as glass. Ava spread out a blanket sketchbook in her lap, while Alexander sat beside her, tracing shapes in the air, as if memorizing the world. You ever think about the future, he asked. Sometimes. And, she shrugged. It feels smaller than it used to, but more real. He nodded slowly. I like that. They sat in silence, the sunlight melting over them. For the first time, it didn't feel like borrowed time, it felt earned. Then softly, Alexander said, I want to marry you again. Ava looked at him, startled. We already are. Not that way, he said. Not for contracts or redemption. Just because I can't imagine waking up without you beside me. Her throat tightened. And if I get sick again? He smiled, eyes glinting with both love and grief. Then I'll learn how to hold you through it. The right way this time. A tear slipped down her cheek, caught by the wind. Then yes. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining against the sunlight. When the sun began to set, Ava leaned against him, breathing in the scent of pine and warmth and home. And for the first time in years, the thought that once haunted her of endings, of fragility, of loss, felt less like a threat and more like truth she could live with. Because love wasn't about forever. It was about now. The breath between one heartbeat and the next. And as the Sierra Hills burned gold beneath the fading light, Ava closed her eyes, whispering the words she'd once been too afraid to say. I'm not afraid anymore. Alexander turned to her, brushing his lips against her temple. Neither am I. The wedding wasn't grand. It was held on a hill overlooking the Sierra Valley, where the grass swayed like gold silk and the wind smelled faintly of cedar. There were no reporters, no board members, no designer gowns that whispered of status. Just 20 people. They loved her mother, his sister, a handful of friends who had seen them through the worst of themselves. Ava wore a dress she'd sewn herself, linen, soft, unstructured, flowing, when the wind caught it. Alexander stood at the altar barefoot, his suit jacket gone, his shirt open at the throat. For once, he looked like a man not performing for the world, but living in it. When she walked toward him, the sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold dust across his face. He smiled, small, reverent, the way someone smiles when they finally find home after being lost too long. After the vows, the guests drifted toward the reception tent below. But Ava and Alexander stayed behind, still on the hill, their hands intertwined. "You realize," she teased, "this is technically our second wedding." He laughed. "The first one doesn't count. It had better catering, but no truth." "Are you saying this one's worse?" He leaned in, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "This one's real. That's better." They stood quietly, the breeze pulling at her veil. Ava's breath caught not from weakness this time, but from the weight of everything that had led them here, the cold Malibu ceremony, the storms, the lies, the loss, the slow undoing of two people until only the truth remained. "This isn't a fairy tale," she whispered. Alexander smiled faintly. "Good. Fairy tales end too soon." That evening they danced under string lights stretched between the pines. The sky deepened into violet. Laughter carried across the valley. Ava rested her head on his shoulder, his hand warm against the small of her back. "I don't remember the last time I felt this free," she said softly. "That's because you built it," he replied. "Freedom doesn't come. You create it." She looked up at him. "And what about you?" He hesitated. "I'm still learning. To let go. To stay." Later, when the guests had gone, and the night turned still, they walked down to the lake at the edge of the property. The moon shimmered across the water, breaking into 1,000 fragments. Ava slipped off her shoes, wading in. The water was cold, biting at her skin. She turned and held out her hand. "Come in." Alexander stood at the edge, watching her with mock suspicion. "You'll freeze." "I'll live," she said. "Maybe." He sighed and stepped in the water, rising around them, laughter echoing through the quiet hills. They stopped in the middle, the reflection of the stars rippling between them. "You ever think about how fragile all of this is?" she asked. "Every day. And it doesn't scare you anymore." "It used to," he admitted. "But now, I think fragility is what makes it beautiful." She smiled, water glinting at her collarbones. "I used to believe strength was about never breaking. And now I think it's about breaking and still choosing to love again." He reached for her, his hand sliding along her jaw, and kissed her slow, deliberate, as if memorizing the moment molecule by molecule. When they pulled apart, he whispered, "Then I'm strong too." Ava laughed softly, the sound scattering over the water. Finally. But happiness, as Ava knew too well, never comes without its shadows. 3 months later, she received a letter. It was from the hospital in San Francisco, a follow-up to her last appointment. The results showed a new complication, a mild fibrosis developing in her lungs. Manageable now, dangerous later. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in a drawer, and told no one. Not yet. The days grew shorter, the air sharper. Alexander spent mornings working on their foundation's new project funding design programs for underprivileged schools. Ava continued sculpting her latest piece titled, "The Breath Between Us." It was abstract, 2 intertwining forms, made of reclaimed metal, rising toward the light. She said it was about resilience. But deep down, it was about them. He'd watch her from the porch, his coffee cooling in his hands, and think how extraordinary it was to witness someone rebuilding the world through art. Sometimes he'd catch her coughing when she thought he wasn't looking. He never asked. She never explained. They existed in a fragile truce of unspoken understanding. Love, for now, was enough. On the first snow of winter, Alexander woke before dawn. Ava wasn't in bed. He found her outside barefoot in the frost, wrapped in a shawl, watching the horizon. Her breath came out in pale clouds. "You'll catch pneumonia again," he murmured, slipping his coat around her shoulders. She smiled faintly. Old habits. He stood beside her, hands tucked in his pockets. "Can't sleep." She shook her head. "It's too quiet. Sometimes quiet feels heavier than noise." He glanced at her profile, the calm curve of her mouth, the faint tremor in her hands. "Ava," he said gently, "what aren't you telling me?" She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Don't make me say it." He stepped closer. "I need to know." Her voice broke. "It's back. The fibrosis. It's slow, but it's there." He froze, breath catching like the air itself had stopped moving. "When did you find out?" 3 months ago. 3. He stopped, shaking his head. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to give us this," she said, gesturing toward the snow. The house, the world they'd made. "I didn't want it to become a countdown again." He stared at her, torn between anger and grief. "You can't protect me from losing you." "I wasn't trying to protect you," she whispered. "I was trying to protect us." The snow fell harder, then soundless and relentless. He reached for her, pulling her against him, burying his face in her hair. She trembled, not from cold, but from the truth finally out in the open. "I don't care how long we have," he said fiercely. "Just don't leave before we're done living." She smiled through her tears. "Then, let's live." And they did. Not forever, not endlessly, but completely. They traveled when she was well enough to Lisbon, Kyoto, the quiet corners of the world where no one knew their names. She painted skies. He photographed light. Together they filled the time they had left with laughter and small miracles. There were hard days too, hospitals, oxygen masks, nights when she couldn't sleep because her lungs felt too small for her dreams. But even then he stayed beside her, whispering stories into the dark. Not promises, just presence. One spring morning, when the hills were green again, Ava woke to sunlight and birdsong. She turned to find him asleep beside her, his hand loosely resting on her wrist, their breaths falling into the same rhythm. She smiled and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." He stirred, eyes half open, and murmured, "Good." She brushed his hair from his forehead. "Do you think love ever ends?" He smiled faintly. "No. I think it just changes its name." Months later, when the illness finally took her, it was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like grace, not absence. She passed in the house they'd built together, the sunlight spilling across the floor. Alexander held her hand until her fingers went still, his tears falling without sound. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, he whispered into the still air, "You were right. Love doesn't end." Years later, visitors would come to see The Breath Between Us, now a centerpiece at the Sierra Modern Art Museum. Two intertwined shapes reaching upward, light caught forever in the metal's curve. No plaque mentioned their names. But if you stood close enough, you could see an inscription hidden at the base. "To the one who taught me how to stay." On the anniversaries of her passing, Alexander still walked the hills at dawn barefoot, as she once did. The wind would carry the scent of pine and paint and memory. Sometimes he swore he heard her voice in it, a soft laugh, a whisper, "Live." And he did. Not for her, but because of her. The sun would rise, spilling light across the valley, and he'd close his eyes, breathing deep, the air filling his lungs like a prayer. Love, he'd learned, wasn't the fire or the ruin. It was the breath that came after.